Sometimes when we read the Book of Mormon, we read it like we're looking at a book that was written yesterday by somebody living in modern America. But that's just not the case. According to the biblical chronology, Nephi is closer in time to Noah than he is to us. So sometimes it's helpful to look at the Book of Mormon in light of its historical context, rather than trying to force our modern idea of things onto the book. This doesn't mean that the Book of Mormon doesn't speak to today. That was the point of the book, is that it speaks to today. But we have to look at it in light of the ancient world, and then we can apply it to today. And I'm going to show you some ways that we can do that. Thankfully, we have a huge amount of information about the ancient Middle East during Nephi's time, including quite a few ancient documents, and we can use these things to help us understand the Book of Mormon on its own terms. So today I'd like to give 7 examples of how these ancient Middle Eastern texts can help us understand the Book of Mormon a little bit better. Number 1. I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents, therefore I was taught somewhat in all the learning of my father, and having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days, yea, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and mysteries of God, therefore I make a record of my proceedings in my days. Now you know this verse. This is the verse you read every year when you decide you're going to read the Book of Mormon through that year for your New Year's resolution. You've read this verse 100 times. But why is it written like that? I, Nephi, having been born of goodly parents? Is that like a letter maybe? But it's not quite like modern letters, and actually it's not like ancient letters either. What is it? Well, in 1891, some German scholars discovered 3 texts from what is today Syria. And they started like this. I, Barakav, son of Panamu. Just like 1 Nephi 1:1, these texts begin with the formula I, name of the person, reference to parentage. We get another one like this from 750 BC. I, Panamu, son of Kirel. These are all from before the time of Lehi. We get one from Moab from 835 BC, 3 from Phoenicia from 820-690, and the 5th century BC. These all come from the ancient Near East, and they're all from at least close to Nephi and Lehi's time. But that's not the only similarity. We get in 1 Nephi 1:1, just later in the verse, having seen many afflictions in the course of my days, nevertheless having been highly favored of the Lord in all my days. So think about that. He's talking about the afflictions he's experienced and being highly favored of the Lord. Well, King Mesha of Moab, around 835 BC, wrote, predictably, I, Mesha, son of Chemishiadi, we know this pattern by now, and then quickly transitions to a discussion of the afflictions he and his people had suffered, and how his god Chemish saved his people from the oppressors. It's just what we get there in the second part of 1 Nephi 1:1. The inscription by Panamu similarly states that the people suffered devastation, but that the gods restored the land. Having seen much affliction over the course of my days, nevertheless having been highly favored of the Lord. Even the phrase, in my days, in 1 Nephi 1:1 resonates with inscriptions like this. 4 of these inscriptions use this exact phrase to talk about the writer's own life. So why is Nephi modeling 1 Nephi 1 after these ancient Near Eastern inscriptions? Seems a little weird. But what did these inscriptions do? These inscriptions commemorated the victory of the king over his enemies. What does 1 Nephi say? What does the title of 1 Nephi say? The first book of Nephi, his reign and ministry. Think about that, his reign. Nephi is eventually going to be a king, right? And he, just like these kings, struggled through all these problems and eventually came out on top. Nephi had huge struggles, first with Laban, and then with his brothers, eventually going to war, actually, with his brothers and their allies. And so if anybody has a right to make an inscription talking about overcoming their enemies, Nephi does. So these monuments, called stela, attribute their victories to the gods. Nephi knew that he owed all his victories not to these fake gods that we got in these inscriptions, but to the true God. 1 Nephi 1:1 again, having had a great knowledge of the goodness and the mysteries of God. But there's something else about this too, this style that I think would have interested Nephi. These monumental inscriptions are on stone. They're not going anywhere. They're permanent. Future generations can come and read about these kings' struggles and the role of their deity in overcoming those struggles. And in fact, of course, we're reading them today, thousands of years down the line. One of them even stated, what I, Matiel, have written will serve as a reminder to my son and to my grandson who come after me. Now, isn't that what Nephi was desperately interested in? Isn't that why he got the brass plates? Isn't that why he was writing all of these things, so that his kids and his grandkids could understand that, yeah, he struggled through these hard things, but that God helped him. Nephi wanted this permanence. Why else do you write on metal plates if you don't want this permanence? It's the same reason that people wrote on the stone. They wanted permanence. And honestly, think about what the church does today. We're interested in permanence. We've got those big vaults out there in the mountains where we have all these records. We're interested in future generations knowing about these things. Nephi was as well, just like these kings that made these monuments were. And that's a significant thing for us today. When we think about Nephi writing how God has helped him overcome his struggles and make it to the top in life, and he wants future generations to be able to read that, well, that's what journals are for us. We write these things so that future generations can know that God helped us and that God can help them. So the second point. Remember how in 1 Nephi 1:1, Nephi said he was going to make a record of his proceedings in his days? Well, this is actually something that we get also from the ancient Near East. You actually see this phrase often throughout ancient Near Eastern texts, the phrase, make a record. But why does he say make a record instead of write a record or write a book? It maybe seems insignificant, but actually it isn't. Ecclesiastes 12:12 says, of making many books there is no end. It's the same kind of thing. Why is it make a book instead of write a book? Well, in his book, Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, Michael Fishbane has pointed out that the reference to making books in Ecclesiastes is slightly weird. Is it physically making books? What is it? Well, some ancient writings composed in the language called Akkadian, it's a language used in what is today Iraq, states that scribes were expected to compose writings. But the word there translated as compose is just a slight variation on the word make. Thus, when these scribes were literally being asked to make a record, they were simply being asked to write a book. Fishbane has argued that the unusual phrase making books, as we found in Ecclesiastes, is a result of the influence of ancient Near Eastern scribal training on the person who wrote those verses of Ecclesiastes. So you go to school to be a scribe, and you learn these certain words and phrases as part of your schooling, and it just becomes a part of how you write. And it looks like the same thing's happening to Nephi. This is actually a technical term. We know scribes used it throughout the ancient Middle East. It was used even by Aramaic-speaking Jews in Egypt as well, from very close to Lehi's time. So we know that this was fairly widespread. But there's another word, too, that's a little bit unusual that Nephi uses. That's the word abridgment. But we get a word that should be translated probably as abridgment in Ecclesiastes 12:9, a verse that also describes ancient scribal practices and what ancient scribes did. It states that the preacher set in order many proverbs. That phrase, set in order, is a translation of just a single word that means to edit or arrange, or really to abridge. So this phrase was also commonly used by scribes in the ancient Middle East, but the fact that references to making a record and abridging texts occur right next to each other in this section of Ecclesiastes, and they also occur next to each other in the Book of Mormon, that is very interesting. It shows that these are technical scribal terms that Nephi is learning. So this shows that Nephi knows these ancient scribal practices and these ancient scribal terms. But what does that mean for us? I think it's a little bit of a reminder not to be afraid of things that come from the outside. Nephi is learning about all these scribal things. He's apparently trained in these scribal practices, and he's getting things from other countries. And he's not sort of afraid to learn from the outside. And I think it's important for us. It's a reminder to us that spiritual knowledge is good and important, but it's also important to get secular knowledge too. Nephi doesn't seem to have been afraid of that. We shouldn't be afraid of it either. Point 3, 1 Nephi 15:26 through 30. And they said unto me, what meaneth the river of water which our father saw? And I said to them that it was an awful gulf which separated the wicked from the saints of God. And I said unto them that it was a representation of that awful hell which the angel said unto me was prepared for the wicked. And I said unto them that our father also saw that the justice of God did also divide the wicked from the righteous, and the brightness thereof was like unto the brightness of a flaming fire, which ascendeth up unto God forever and ever, and hath no end. Well, what is that? Is it a river? Is it a gulf? Is it fire? What? Is it a flaming river? What is this? Well, this image, it seems like it's a river of fire. We actually do see this from the ancient Middle East. This is associated with a religion called Zoroastrianism. That's a long word you can throw around and impress your friends at parties. Zoroastrianism. It's the ancient religion of Iran. And in texts from this religion, called the Gathas, it talks about this exact thing, actually. It talks about a river of fire that was associated with the justice and judgment of God. And the idea was that for the final judgment, you had this flaming river, this river of molten metal, and everybody would walk through this river of molten metal, and to the righteous it would feel like a bath, and the wicked would get obliterated in this flaming river. It's kind of weird, but it's what we're seeing here in the Book of Mormon, that it's dividing the wicked from the righteous. That's exactly the function of this river. And it keeps the wicked from going to the righteous. And it's this awful gulf, and it's this flaming fire, and it's a river, right? It's just what we're seeing here in the vision. And that idea, that helps to explain this a little bit, because it ties this to the idea of the final judgment, which I think is very significant. And there's a lot in the Book of Mormon that at least alludes to this idea of the final judgment. But it looks like we're seeing some of that here too as well. But it helps to explain this very strange oddity of what is this? Is this really a flaming river? Well, yeah, it is actually, and probably comes from Zoroastrianism. So the next point, cursed shall be the land, yea, this land, unto every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, unto destruction, which do wickedly when they are fully ripe. And as I have said, so shall it be, for this is the cursing and blessing of God upon the land. For the Lord cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance. That's Alma 45:16. But that phrase, the Lord cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance, where does that come from, least degree of allowance? Well, once again, this same Zoroastrian text, the Gathas, says, for he who looks upon evil with tolerance is none other than evil. But that can also be translated, he who looks upon sin with allowance is none other than evil. So let's see why Alma's maybe using this. We get this, we can read the rest of the sentence from the Gathas and see what's going on here. It says, for he who will not help to transform evil shall be with those in the abode of the lie. For he who looks upon evil with tolerance is none other than evil. And indeed righteous is he who supports the righteous. These are thy laws since the dawn of creation. Now think about that for a second. When it says there in Alma 45, it's talking about doing wickedly, well, what does that mean exactly? Looking at it in light of the Gathas helps us understand what that means to do wickedly. In the Gathas, doing wickedly is not just about being a bad person about doing bad things. It's about not doing good things either. So in Alma 45, when it's talking about doing wickedly, is he just talking about being actively bad? Well, maybe not. Maybe he's also talking about not supporting the right, not actively encouraging right things to happen. And I think that may be implied there in Alma. It's not just about not doing the wrong thing. Righteousness is also about actively doing the right thing as well. So example 5, King Benjamin's speech from Isaiah 4:30. If ye do not watch yourselves and your thoughts and your words and your deeds, and observe the commandments of God, and continue in the faith of what ye have heard concerning the coming of our Lord, even unto the end of your lives ye must perish. And now, O man, remember and perish not. Now think about that. Watch yourselves and your thoughts and your words and your deeds. Well, in the Gathas it says there are two kinds of thought, of speech, of deed. Exactly the same words, exactly the same order. The better and the evil, and between them well-doers discriminate rightly, but ill-doers do not. So think about that. In King Benjamin's speech, I think when we compare it with the Gathas, the implication is there are two ways of doing things, the right way and the wrong way. And if you do not watch your thoughts, your words, and your deeds, and make sure you're doing things the right way, then you must perish. There's this stark contrast between right and wrong. And the juxtaposition between the Gathas and King Benjamin's speech remind us that there's a stark contrast, and we need to choose the right way and reject the wrong way. Example 6. Hear the words of a trembling parent whose limbs ye must soon lay down in the cold and silent grave from whence no traveler can return. But behold, the Lord hath redeemed my soul from hell. I have beheld his glory, and I am encircled about eternally in the arms of his love. Now, this is Lehi in 2 Nephi 1:14-15. Well, what does it sound like? A lot of people say, well, this sort of sounds like Hamlet, actually. It sounds like something from Shakespeare. But that phrase, cold and silent grave from whence no traveler can return, also sounds like something much more ancient. Let me read you a little bit of it. To the land of no return. the land of darkness. Ishtar, the daughter of Sin, directed her thought. To the house of shadows, the dwelling of her Kala, to the house without exit for him who enters therein, to the road whence there is no turning. So, yeah, it sort of sounds like Shakespeare, but it definitely sounds like this. This is exactly what we would expect to find if Nephi has scribal training, if Lehi has scribal training, and they know these texts from the ancient Middle East. But what about the rest of that? Behold, the Lord hath redeemed my soul from hell. I have beheld his glory and am encircled about eternally in the arms of his love. Well, let's look at this text. This is called the Dissent of Ishtar, the text I was just reading to you. In this story, the goddess Ishtar goes down to hell and basically gets stuck down there in the underworld. And this semi-divine figure, Ashushunamer, goes down to the underworld, puts his arm around her, and leads her up out of hell. So think about what Lehi's saying. He references the first few lines of this, presumably so that it's a signal, you know he's going to be talking about this for a minute. And then he references what happens in the myth, that this Ashushunamer guy comes, redeems Ishtar, brings her up out of hell, and encircles her about in his arms. Now, why? Why is Lehi referring to this text? Well, I think he's referring to this text as a reminder that, yeah, in this myth, in this story, Ashushunamer goes down and redeems Ishtar from hell. But he's reminding us, Lehi's reminding us, that there is somebody who really is going to redeem us from hell, and that somebody is Christ. He is going to come, wrap his arms around us, and redeem us from hell. And that's a beautiful image. And when you know the myth, it helps you to understand that a little bit better. But finally, there's one final point, point 7, that helps to sort of wrap up and make sense of everything we've been talking about. 1 Nephi 11 through 14, Nephi had a vision in which heavenly messengers showed him various things that would happen in the future. They also explained to him the symbolic vision of his father. Similar to books like Zechariah, but these are from after Lehi left, Zechariah, Daniel, and the book of Enoch and things like that. But these books, like I said, were written all after Lehi left Jerusalem. Is there another text that's maybe closer, maybe from closer to Lehi's time? Well, actually, yes, there is. It's an Akkadian text called the Underworld Vision of an Assyrian Prince. In this story, a guy named Kume was shown a vision of the underworld. And actually, according to Richard J. Clifford, a scholar of texts like this, called apocalypticism, this text is of interest as a precedent for the tours of heaven and hell that are popular in later apocalypses. So basically, this is where those later texts come from, actually, is they all draw from this. But this is from the early 7th century BC. This is maybe from roughly 100 years before Lehi. This is really exactly the time period that we would expect to see Lehi and Nephi drawing from. So this is very similar to 1 Nephi 11 through 14. In it, the Assyrian prince Kume experiences an expansive vision, just like Nephi does. Nephi, who is eventually going to become king, and so in that way is a prince of sorts, experiences this significant vision. In both cases, both in the case of the Assyrian prince and in the case of Nephi, they ask to receive the vision, and the gods grant their request. Nephi asks the Spirit of the Lord if he can see what his father had seen and was granted that vision, in 1 Nephi 11:3. The same thing happens to Kume. He asks the God for this vision, and the gods grant his request. Kume was shown an ideal king called the Exalted Shepherd, who was given responsibility over many things by the God of the underworld. Nephi also was similarly told that there is one God and one shepherd over all the earth. And in his vision, the kingdom of Christ was celebrated. So we see Christ as this shepherd and king, just as we see here in this Assyrian text. Kume was shown some strange symbolic objects, like Nephi was, and the god Nergal explained to Kume some of what he was seeing. And it's the same thing in 1 Nephi. The Spirit of the Lord shows him these strange symbolic objects and explains to him what he's looking at. In the Assyrian text, the god Nergal decreed broad destruction on Kume's people. He says, "May distress, acts of violence, and rebellion together bow you down, so that by their oppressive clamor sleep may not come to you." But Nephi has the same thing. He's told that his people would experience calamities and actually eventually be destroyed. Kume was also told that if he forgot this important god, Nergal, then the god would pass a verdict of annihilation on him. And that's what we see throughout the Book of Mormon. And so we see all these similarities between this ancient Assyrian text and the Book of Mormon. So once again, why? Why would God use this Assyrian text as a way to teach Nephi. But this helps us to reinforce what we've been talking about this whole time. It helps us see one way that God communicates with his children. God could have answered Nephi's prayer in any number of ways. He could have used any mode of vision or revelation, any kind of answer to his prayer. But what he does is he knows Nephi's going to be familiar with this text, so he uses it as a way to teach him. He says, yeah, so this is like that text that you've already read, so I'm just going to use this as a teaching moment for you. And that is really how God does things for us today. Think about that for a second. Think about one of President Monson's talks. If in 3,000 years you're reading one of President Monson's talks and he's talking about the Second World War, well, you're not going to know what he's talking about. It's going to be helpful to know a little bit about the U.S. Navy in the 20th century if you want to understand some things he's talking about in his talk. But for us, it makes perfect sense. We know about the Second World War, so when President Monson gives a talk, we don't have to go look it up in a book somewhere. We know the context. It's easy for us to understand what he's saying. But that's because God communicates to people on their own terms and their own time. He speaks to men according to their understanding, as it says in the Book of Mormon. And that's what we should continue to expect. That's what he does for us today. We should expect that he would have done that during Book of Mormon times. And that's why it's helpful to do what we did today. To look at the Book of Mormon in its ancient context, understand its ancient context, so that we can get more out of it. Now, I'm not saying that the Book of Mormon is this inaccessible text. I'm actually saying the exact opposite. Once we understand it in its ancient context, then we can do just what we've done this whole time and apply it to ourselves today. But I'd like to wrap up with one final point. These texts that I've been talking about today from the ancient Near East were actually unknown in 1829. They were all discovered later. They were either dug up later, or that we knew the texts, but we didn't know how to translate them well until later. And so it's a little bit of a reminder of the antiquity of the Book of Mormon. And the more we do this, the more we look at these ancient texts in light of the Book of Mormon, the more we can make sense of all of this and understand it better. That's one big reason why the Book of Mormon archive is what it is. So you can go through and look at the Book of Mormon scholarship that talks about connections between the ancient world and the Book of Mormon. And it's all out there for you, free for you to use. Just go in and start to look at it, read it, think about it, and see how, when you understand the Book of Mormon in its ancient context, it can speak to you today. I started by talking about how old the Book of Mormon was, and it's old. But it's not so old that it can't speak to us today. Learn about it in its context, and let it speak to the present and help you through the struggles you experience in life.